Thank you very much. Delighted to be here on a kind of fateful day in American politics. The United States in 2018 is probably more fractured, more divided than at any time since 1860, when Abraham Lincoln, an outsider, a Republican, won a close election, and one may say all hell broke loose. I've been trying to make sense of the results of yesterday. I think we'd have to say that there was no blue wave and there was no red wave. What we got was a certain kind of political draw. But that's not a meeting in the middle, but rather that the Democrats had one good thing happen and the Republicans have had one good thing happen, which is now topped off by a second good thing. For the Democrats, the good thing is to capture the House. And that's important not because the Democrats can do anything with it, but it does give them a sort of place to launch projectiles. And it gives them a chance to launch investigations. Of course, they can pass legislation, but it's going to go nowhere. It is also a way to check Trump. And I suspect that there is a feeling in America, among some people, including some Republicans, that Trump is a man who could use a little bit of checking. Now, on the Republican side, there is also good news, and that is that Republicans have a kind of secure majority in the Senate, which the Republicans didn't have before. So the Republicans have actually traded control. Before, they really had the House, but they didn't have the Senate. And they were dependent on a very precarious one or two votes, particularly for court appointments. And that's why the Kavanaugh thing was just so close. But now Republicans have a clean majority in the Senate. And that means that Ruth Bader Ginsburg better take her vitamins, because otherwise we could quickly go from 5-4 to 6-3, and it is not inconceivable that you could also have 7-2. So if you ask most Republicans, would you trade the House for a reasonable shot at 6-3 or 7-2 on the court, I suspect most would make that bargain very quickly. Today something very interesting happened, and that is that Jeff Sessions, aka Rip Van Winkle, has been put out on the sidewalk. And the reports are that Rod Rosenstein, his sidekick, the initiator of the Mueller investigation, might soon follow. This is really important because Trump's great weakness in the past 2 years has been that the guy does not control his own Justice Department. This is because of Trump's greatest mistake of his presidency, which was not to fire Comey and Rosenstein on day one. He could have done it easily. No one would have questioned it. It would have saved him a whole lot of problems. One of the downsides of being an outsider is that you come in and you sort of try to figure things out. And by the time you've figured them out, all kinds of things have taken off, including the appointment of a special prosecutor. But now Trump has actually the chance to name his own guy. And what that means is that if the Democrats initiate investigations, the Justice Department can initiate counter-investigations. And this is all a way of saying that American politics has entered a sort of fractious, troubling phase. There's a breakdown of civility. I think we know that. There's certainly a rising level of emotional intensity. We know that. I just saw on social media a video of a protester screaming about my presence here tonight. He, white guy, and he goes, "You don't know what it means to be a person of color." And I thought, well, if there's one thing I do know, it's that. And if there's one thing you don't, it's that. But nevertheless, this notion of me being educated by whites on what it is like to be an immigrant, not a new experience, but nevertheless intriguing. I want to speak tonight about the sort of deep undertow of this debate. It's a kind of culture war. Some would call it a cold civil war. It's obviously not a hot civil war. You don't have grand armies moving across plains. But it's a cold civil war in that there is a clear secession of the American mind. And what I mean by that is that you have two groups of Americans who see the same things, the same facts. Let's say the Kavanaugh hearings. But they see them completely differently. And intellectually, this is a problem. How is it possible for intelligent people to see the same facts and interpret them so differently? Well, clearly, they're bringing different assumptions, a different lens, you might say, to the camera. And there are premises embedded in the debate that are completely rejected by the other side. Believe all victims. Or even take something like he said, she said. Now, for those of us who are supporters of Kavanaugh, this was not a case of he said, she said. Why? Because he said, she said only applies in a situation where both parties are completely unknown and you have no basis for actually assigning credibility to either one. If a cop goes into a domestic violence complaint, he said, she said. You don't know anything about the two parties, and so you have to give them equal credibility or equal lack of credibility. But with Kavanaugh, it's not like that. And with Kavanaugh, it's more like something like this. Someone comes out and accuses Albert Einstein of faking his equations. Well, that's not he said, she said. Albert Einstein is a public figure. Innumerable scientists have testified to his credibility and intellectual probity. And in the case of Kavanaugh, you have innumerable people who have worked with him over decades testifying to his personal decency and rectitude. And then you have a complete nobody who pops out of nowhere, scrubs our social media. So that's not he said, she said. You have two figures of completely unequal public credibility. And so anyone who starts the debate with he said, she said is distorting the lens of the debate, distorting the lens of the argument. Well, now, I use the Kavanaugh example merely to make a point, which is that there is a divide, and the divide is over facts, over news, over what some people call fake news. I'm going to talk tonight not so much about fake news, but I'm going to talk about fake scholarship, and I'm going to talk about fake history. And fake scholarship and fake history are the key to the narrative that the political left has generated in America. And all our public accusations are based upon this deeper narrative. If the narrative is false, a lot of what we hear in the public domain collapses. So take something really simple. Trump is a fascist. We hear this all the time. We've been hearing it since Trump's election. If you turn on Rachel Maddow, Chris Maddow, Trump is a fascist. They know it. But this notion, this accusation that Trump is a fascist is parasitic on a deeper claim. And the deeper claim is fascism is a phenomenon of the right. It's a right-wing thing. Think about it. If fascism were a left-wing, then it would make no sense to call Trump a fascist. And yet the notion that fascism is right-wing is not something recent. It wasn't concocted with Trump. It's in fact 75 years old. This notion that fascism is on the right started after World War II. It's in our textbooks. It's on the History Channel. It's in Wikipedia. It's all over the place. And yet, this notion that fascism is on the right is rarely challenged. It's rarely challenged. And in fact, it is so dangerous to challenge it. We see it right now, that when you begin to do it, it disturbs people. It unnerves them. Why? Because their worldview is at stake. If I could demonstrate tonight that fascism was on the left, the real fascists would have to shut up. The real fascists would have to suddenly say, wait a minute, we have been masquerading as anti-fascists. We excuse all kinds of barbaric conduct, threatening people, intimidating them, shouting at them, beating them up on the grounds that those guys are the fascists and we are the anti-fascists. But if the truth is the opposite, then the whole political landscape has to be redrawn and the real thugs become unmasked for who they are. So I'm going to take that risk tonight of pushing down and examining a couple of key episodes of American history just to ask two questions. Who are the real racists? And who are the real fascists? Yes, buckle your seatbelts. Buckle your seatbelts. I'm going to start with the issue of racism. Racism which became embedded in America because of the long-standing practice of slavery. Slavery was, you might say, the institutionalized context for racism in the United States. And yet, this racism, interestingly enough, is always blamed by the left on the American founders. They started it. They're the culprits. And the proof of this, if you want to pick it right off progressive literature from Howard Zinn or any of these other shady characters who masquerade as historians, it's the 3/5 clause. Hey, it says right there in the Constitution, African Americans are worth 3/5 of a human being. Now, if this were true, we would have to admit that the American founding was seriously flawed. But it so happens that it is demonstrably not true. And it is easy to verify by simply looking at the context for the actual debate, which was a debate between the North and the South. And it was a debate not over slavery directly, but over political representation, over the assignment of congressmen, for example. And in this debate, very interestingly, the North wanted blacks to count for 0. And the South wanted blacks to count for 1. Why? Because the South wanted more representation to strengthen the power of slavery. And the North wanted to count blacks for 0, not because they were racist, but because they wanted to weaken the power of the South. And the 3/5 compromise was a middle ground between the North and the South, in a sense, the two sides agreeing to find a point at which they could both move ahead. And one can debate if this was a good compromise or not. But what one cannot debate is that this said absolutely nothing about the intrinsic value of black life or about the intrinsic value of blacks as human beings. The issue was the North was using the compromise to break the back of slavery in the South and weaken the power of Southern representation. This is an historical fact. I want to vault forward a little bit and now come to Abraham Lincoln. And I come to Lincoln because Lincoln was the great student of the American founding. And Lincoln is very important because today the left has tried to appropriate Lincoln. Lincoln was a liberal. Lincoln was a progressive. If Lincoln had lived today, he would be, you know, a member of Antifa. Really? Now, history is a matter of trying to get into the spirit and the mind of people who lived at the time. The interesting thing about Abraham Lincoln is not once in his life or his writings did he ever call himself a liberal. Not once did he ever call himself a progressive. In fact, the whole concept of progressivism developed later. It's a phenomenon in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, after Lincoln. The one thing that Lincoln did call himself repeatedly was, you guessed it, a conservative. And what Lincoln said is, I am conserving the principles of the American founding. Now, when Lincoln described slavery, he described it this way: you work, I eat. And this is a very profound understanding of slavery. It's not even racial. The basic idea is one guy gets to work, and the other guy steals the fruit of his labor and disposes of it as he deems fit. So this is slavery. It's essentially confiscation and theft. And Lincoln says very interestingly, this is the credo, not of the South, but of the Democratic Party in the North and the South. This is what Democrats believe. This is who they are at their core. And then Lincoln defines who the Republicans are, by contrast. He goes, Republicans believe, quote, The hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. The principle here is very simple. People should get to keep the fruit of their own labor. It's the anti-slavery principle. We own ourselves. We have a right to keep what we earn. And here's Lincoln's definition of social justice. You keep what you make, and I'll keep what I make. The street sweeper has no more right to take the earnings of the brain surgeon than the brain surgeon has the right to take the earnings of the street sweeper. This is Lincoln's doctrine. And I mention this because today, it's not uncommon for me on campus to encounter professors. Well, Dinesh, you absolutely know that the two parties switch sides. Well, did they really switch sides? Let's examine. Isn't it true today that the core principle of Trump and of the Republican Party is that the hand that makes the corn should eat the corn? And is it not a fact? Well, we're happy to discuss it. I think it is. And the core principle of the Democratic Party today is also just the one that Lincoln defined. You work and I eat. One guy gets to work and another group of scoundrels confiscates what he earns or she earns and disposes of it as they see fit. What's very interesting about this is that despite party change, the parties have changed, there are also deep veins of continuity. And this deep vein of continuity shows that the fundamental core principle of the parties, a pro-market, pro-upward mobility, free society, which Lincoln championed, that's what we conservatives in America are fighting for now. Now, Lincoln named what he called the four horsemen. He didn't say of the apocalypse, but he meant of slavery. The four bad guys of slavery. And it's very important to pay attention to this because what Lincoln is showing is that these four guys are not Southerners. In fact, only one of the four is a Southerner. Lincoln names Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision, from Maryland. Lincoln counts him as a Southerner. And then we have Franklin Pierce, the former president, from New Hampshire, Northern Democrat. And James Buchanan, the sitting president, from Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat. And Stephen Douglas of Illinois, Northern Democrat. Now, the reason this is really important is that right now there are massive statues of Douglas, of Pierce, of Buchanan, all standing in their hometowns, untouched by Antifa or Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter and Antifa are in the South, knocking down statues, knocked down Robert E. Lee, knocked down the Confederate statue. This Confederate soldier was a bad guy. First of all, this Confederate soldier, the nameless Confederate soldier, which is the majority of the statues, was typically a dirt poor farmer or laborer. He didn't own a single slave, and when asked why he was fighting in the Civil War, his simple answer was because the Yankees are down here. You want to make that guy the bad guy of American history? If you do, it's fake history. You're a fake. Why? Because that's not the bad guy. The bad guy were the conspirators in the North who worked with the plantation owners in the South to sustain slavery. And Lincoln had their number. But progressives have to hide the complicity of the Northern Democrats because what they're doing is taking the crimes of the Democratic Party and foisting them on the South. They're basically trying to hold the South accountable for what they did. And Lincoln was onto them then, and I have to say I'm kind of onto them now. I now want to fast forward from Lincoln and a couple of words I've said about slavery to fascism. I want to come to the 20th century, moving us along the swift course of history. And I want to address a question that Trump sort of kicked up when he said he was a nationalist. And of course, there was somebody on CNN saying, how can you use that word? Nationalist. It's like Hitler. Now, Hitler, in fact, was a nationalist. But so was my countryman Gandhi. And so was Mandela in South Africa. And so was Winston Churchill. And so was de Gaulle. And so was Abraham Lincoln. And all the anti-colonial leaders were nationalists. So clearly, there is more than one type of nationalism. What is the type of nationalism that defined Hitler? And by extension, Mussolini, and by extension, all the fascist movements in Belgium, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in England, and so on. And the answer is there's only one thing that identified that type of nationalism, and that was its marriage with socialism. The essence of fascism is the marriage of nationalism and socialism. And the reason that the left can never admit this is that the moment they do, their whole big lie blows up, and National Socialism is vividly exposed as a phenomenon of the left. Now, I'm not just alleging this in some vague sense. I actually, in my book, look at the founding fathers of fascism in numerous countries. I'm going to take the simple example of France. There was a powerful fascist movement in France. When the Germans invaded France, these people became the intellectual soul of the Vichy regime. And these guys, the founders of French fascism, were all men of the left. There was no exception to this rule. Jean Alemán, who was involved with the Dreyfus case, the so-called grandfather of French socialism, one of the founders of French fascism. Marcel Diet, prominent socialist, became the leader of the fascist movement in France. Jacques Doriot was the head of the French Communist Party, and he became a leading fascist. Mussolini in Italy, his chief advisor, was the founder of Italian fascism, a friend of Lenin. And when Mussolini started the fascist movement in Italy, he got a telegram of congratulations from Lenin, who recognized him as a fellow revolutionary of the left. Now, why was National Socialism so leftist? What was it trying to accomplish? The basic idea of fascism was government control over the private economy and government control over the lives of citizens. That's the meaning of fascism. That's what it is. That's what the Nazis were all about, the National Socialist Party. In my movie, well,
we believe Dr. Ford. We believe Dr. Ford. We believe Dr. Ford. We believe Dr. Ford.
Well,
We believe Dr. Ford.
we have some Dr. Ford enthusiasts here. Let me ask you this question. Let me ask you guys this question. Well, okay, if you'll stop chanting, I'll address your point. Here's something interesting. Where is Dr. Ford? You know, this is really interesting. When I noticed that when Roy, hold on, don't shout at me, you'll have a chance to ask questions. When Roy Moore was attacked by all these women, he oppressed me, he did this, he did that, and suddenly, when he's defeated, they all melt into air. This is Karl Marx, all that is solid melts into air. Suddenly, the media, hold on, don't shout at me, don't shout at me, no, you came voluntarily. Did I ask you to come? No, don't shout at me. I'm defending fascism. No, I'm exposing you as a fascist. Because, do you realize, I'll tell you how. You asked me a question. Hold on. Are you familiar with the black shirts in Italy or the brown shirts in Germany? Do you realize that they would go to campuses, goons, and would stand in the back of the room, and when somebody tried to make an intelligent presentation and answer questions, they would shout them down, yell at them, try to intimidate them, and count as success if they could get the event canceled and the speaker threatened. But see, the problem is, sometimes you get speakers like me who are not scared of people like you. We recognize your frauds. I recognize that ultimately you are afraid of ideas. You're not willing to engage with me. Yes, you're afraid of ideas. You're not afraid of fascists. You think I pose a threat to you? I'm an immigrant. I came to America with nothing. What threat do I pose to you?
You promoted dangerous, violent ideas that kill millions of people.
I propose dangerous, violent ideas that kill people? Who have I killed?
You look at capitalism. You are a part of
Capitalism? Do you realize that Hitler's deadly opponent was capitalism? Have you read the Nazi 25-point platform? Let me give you a few themes from it. State control of the banks. Do you support that? No. State control of healthcare. Do you support that? State control of education. Do you support that? No. All right. What I'm trying to get at is the fascist ideology is one that is distinctly on the left. Whether or not you personally support it.
Not any political theory. Fascism is specifically on the right. It is talking about a race superior to another. You are not saying is on the left has problems. The left has been co-opted.
All right, hold on. I don't look. In fairness, there's going to be plenty of time to engage you. But let me just say this. No movement that calls itself a national socialist movement is going to be on the right. And the idea that the fascists are right-wing because they support racial superiority, wait a minute. The guy who showed the Ku Klux Klan movie in the White House was Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat. So progressivism was married to racism at the hip. So don't pretend it was a right-wing phenomenon. It wasn't. Now, let me continue because it segues right into where I was before, and that is I was talking about a scene in my movie, a scene that I think if you didn't know my work, you would find kind of bewildering, and that is you have a group of Nazis, the top Nazis in 1935, who are making the Nuremberg laws, which make Jews into second-class citizens. They involve segregation of Jews into ghettos, outlawing intermarriage between Jews and other Germans, and confiscation of Jewish property. And these guys making the Nuremberg laws, interestingly, you'll see them in the movie, they have in their hands the democratic laws of the Jim Crow South. They have the American laws made by the Democrats, and they are crossing out the word black and writing in the word Jew. I'm not saying that the Nazis had similar laws to the Democrats. I'm saying they got it from the Democrats. They were indirectly influenced by the democratic laws, and they used them as a model. Now, you might ask, Dinesh, the opposition retreats out of ideas. No problem. They can't argue this stuff. It's because they don't know anything, but they have a lot of heat. And the combination of anger and ignorance can only result in outbursts of irritation or fleeing the room. And the intellect is suppressed by this kind of unfortunate process. And it's the job of education to kind of prevent it. But unfortunately, it's become kind of widespread. All right. So now you might say, wait a minute, Dinesh, you're showing a scene of Nazis learning from Democrats, and I have never heard this in my life, and I consider myself an educated person, and I've never read a book about it, and it's not in any textbook in high school or in college, and I concede that's true. So I ask the question, how is this possible? Where am I getting it? The answer is I'm getting it from a whole body of historical scholarship, including the Yale legal historian James Whitman and his recent book, Hitler's American Model, in which Whitman has the transcripts of the meeting and he lays it out chapter and verse. And he's familiar with my work and he has never criticized me in public for this. Here's the interesting thing with Whitman. He's a progressive. He's on the left. He doesn't want to put the blame on the left, even though he knows it belongs there. And so he hides this by switching Democrat to American. Notice Hitler's American model. Hitler got it from America. But these were democratic laws. Think about this. This is the fact that is left out of James Whitman's book. Every segregation law in the American South from the 1880s to the 1950s was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials, and there is no exception to this rule. Once you plug in that fact, you realize that Hitler's American model should be retitled Hitler's Democratic model. Now, I mention all this, by the way, because this is not just history. The reason we're talking about history is because if we look around objectively today, I think we would have to admit that the fascist streak that we see in American politics, and I admit it's there, but it's predominantly on the left. Who are the people suppressing speech? They come from the left. Who are the people who use the weapons of the state against their political opponents? They're on the left. I'll give you an example from my own infamous case, and somebody mentioned it earlier. I go before the Justice Department. This is the team ultimately headed by Obama, of course, but Eric Holder, and in New York City, Preet Bharara, this fellow Indian guy of mine, fellow of a very recognizable Indian type. If you watch the movie Slumdog Millionaire, he is one of the ringleaders in that movie. A water boy, someone who's willing to do work for the bad guys. And so they sit me down, they go, Dinesh, did you exceed the campaign finance laws? And I go, well, I actually did. I was trying to help a friend of mine, a Dartmouth friend of mine I've known for 25 years. I didn't mean to do it, but I did it. And so I'll take whatever penalty other people get for doing the same thing. And the US government says to me, no, that's not our idea at all. We're going to get you for bank fraud. And I go, bank fraud? They go, yeah, because you took your money out of the bank. And then I go, wow. And then they go, we're going to get you for mail fraud. And I go, mail fraud? They go, yeah, because you put your check in the mail. And it then occurred to me that what was going on was that the US government was using this accordion of federal statutes to redescribe my offense in 6 different ways, attach a charge to each one, and use laws that were designed to get rid of Al Capone and the mafia and ISIS, laws of surveillance, laws of intimidation. If you can't get Capone on murder, let's get him on this technicality. They were using this against US citizens to go after their political opponents. And if that's not fascism, I don't know what is. And I saw it firsthand. Now, racism. A very good question to ask is, where is the racism today? Where is the racism today? If the parties did not switch sides, as they manifestly did not, the proof of this, by the way, is you simply, this is the beauty of living today. We all have a phone, and the left, let's just take the Princeton historian Kevin Cruz, the racist Dixiecrats all became Republicans because of Richard Nixon's tricky strategy, tricky Dick and all that. All right, for our proof, we make a list of all the racist Dixiecrats, and there they are, about 200 of them. These are the people who joined the Dixiecrat Party, or they voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And now we ask, how many became Republicans? Let's count. And the correct answer is 2. 1 in the House, Albert Watson, 1 in the Senate, Strom Thurmond, and all the other racist Dixiecrats lived and died and are lionized to this day in the Democratic Party, and there are buildings right here in Washington, D.C. named after them. So this notion that the racist Dixiecrats became Republicans is an empirical falsehood and a flat lie. Now, where is the racism today? People say, Dinesh, are you actually saying the Democratic Party is the same as it was in 1830? No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying that the progressive left has faked the evidence of racism and tried to pin the racist tail on the Republican elephant by claiming that the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan and the white nationalists are all Trump supporters. Well, what is the proof for this remarkable statement? Has anyone actually done a survey, a poll, a count, provided any empirical data whatsoever to show? I'm happy to listen to everyone answer me. I like that kind of slaughterhouse aspect of the Q&A, so save it for them. But what I'm getting at here is that there is no such empirical evidence in existence. The only proof for white supremacists being Trumpsters is the images of Charlottesville of white nationalists wearing Trump hats. And since I smelled a rat, I've actually done an investigation of the leading white nationalists to a man and to a woman. And if you read my book, you will see that every single one of them has a deep history in the left. Jason Kessler, the organizer of both Charlottesville rallies, longtime Obama activist, Occupy Wall Street guy. That's a fact. And it's a fact known to the media at the time, but suppressed. Number 2, the editor of the neo-Nazi website, Andrew Anglin, is a leftist and environmentalist, hates white people, is open about it. That's a fact. And in the movie, if you watch my movie, I bring in Richard Spencer, the poster boy of white supremacy, and what ensues is an eye-opening interview in which I ask him simple questions that make it blindingly obvious that he is on the far left. Who's his favorite president? They're all Democrats. What does he think of Reagan? He hates him. What does he think of national health care? Great idea. Does he think our rights come from God? No. Where'd they come from? They come from the state. And on it goes. And so you're viewing this, and it suddenly dawns on you that you have been subjected to the fakest of fake news, a massive public relations con that presents the white nationalists as right-wing when, to a man, and out of their own mouths, they are all left-wing. Now, if they're not the racists, usually when someone says the racism is over there and they're trying to hide something, what they really mean is, don't look over here. One of the things I want to suggest, and I'll leave you with this and open the door to questions, is that the Democratic Party has always been the party of the plantation. The plantation defines the Democratic Party. It always has. By the way, the plantation does not define the founding. There were plantations at the time of the founding, but not so many. It was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin that produced the massive, that was in 1793, by the way, that produced the massive expansion of the cotton plantations. The cotton industry began to spread in the American South in the 19th century, and a political party, the Democratic Party, arose to defend, advocate, and protect the plantation in the North and the South. Now, where's the plantation today? If you read the historian Kenneth Stamp in his book, The Peculiar Institution, he says that the plantation, the old slave plantation, was characterized by 5 features: dilapidated housing, slave quarters; broken families, because slavery was nowhere legal in any slave state for the slaves; third, no advancement, no one gets ahead; 4, there's a high degree of violence to hold the place together, because slavery, of course, is based on force; and 5th, a pervasive atmosphere of nihilism and despair. And what I suggest is that today we find those exact same 5 features in the black ghettos, in the Latino barrios, on the Native American reservations. We find them not just in Oakland and Detroit and St. Louis. We find them in the Latino barrios of South Texas and LA. We find them in the Pine Ridge Reservation, which I visited in South Dakota. And as you walk around and you look around, you see all the essential features of the old slave plantation, and there they are, and it's one-party rule, and the Democrats have controlled these places for decades, and they never seem to change no matter how much money you spend on them. There's dependency, there's servitude, there's nihilism, and those are all features that were there historically before, and it's the same party that's doing it. So I leave you with the thought that a lot of what we call history is in fact progressive history. We should not be so naive as young scholars to think that history doesn't come from a bias, from a point of view. I have a point of view. I'm an immigrant, and when I come to America, I bring an immigrant point of view. In fact, to be honest with you, a lot of progressive history strikes me as uninteresting, because those are not, to me, the important questions to ask at all. I'm not interested in finding out whether or not people are oppressed in American society. I see that all over the world. What I'm interested in is, how does a society take poor people and make them rich? How does a society begin as one of the poorest countries in the world, as America was in 1800, and become by 1900 the richest society in the world? Who made that happen? Who thought of that idea? That's not in the history books. No one even discusses it. Fake history. And so I want to leave you with the idea that we need to have a debate about history. Figure out if I'm right, or if what you see on the History Channel is right. Yeah, if you type in fascism in Wikipedia, it's going to say that fascism is on the right. Why? Because the idiots who wrote that have been reading the same history books that I'm criticizing. So that's where they're getting it. You can't take that as confirmation of the truth, because they're just lifting it from the same source. Ultimately, it's about debate. But debate can only occur in an atmosphere of freedom. My only objection to the students who were yelling and screaming a moment ago is they don't like the atmosphere of intellectual exchange. It's threatening to them. They ultimately feel that they have a certain moral right to trump dissidents who don't agree with them, but who are perfectly willing to hear them out, as they are not willing to hear me out. And I want to leave you with the thought that you should be very intolerant of that kind of intolerance. Don't be suckers for it, just as you shouldn't be suckers for received wisdom. If you doubt anything I said today, check it out. Look it up for yourself. At the end of the day, it seems to me America is a country. Lincoln called it the last best hope on earth. And there's got to be something very uniquely powerful about it, and powerfully good about it, because it remains today the same magnet for immigrants that it was in Lincoln's day. Whether we can debate illegal versus legal immigrants. The bottom line of it is lots of people want to come here. And this is in fact the clue that tipped me off to the idea that the multicultural mantra that all cultures are equal and no culture is better or worse, superior or inferior to any other, which I heard at Dartmouth a generation ago. Right away I knew it was a lie. Because I thought to myself, if all cultures are equal, everybody would stay home. Why would you get up and leave your family and your friends and the whole world that you know? We're not talking about refugees. We're talking about people who voluntarily move from one culture to another. The only reason to do that is because you have decisively voted with your feet in the most powerful way possible that this new society is better than the one you came from. And that's why you're willing to bet your life, which is all that you have, on that decision. That is ultimately the whiff of freedom. The whiff of freedom backed up with knowledge. That's what it ultimately does to make us, here in the university context, Americans. And I urge you to follow that path, even though it requires a certain element of bravery to do that. Thank you very much.